Hello and welcome to this podcast where we are going to take a look at what suffering is. Absolutely amazing topic to look at. I want to acknowledge an essay by Hampton Keathley III. He was a 1966 graduate of Dallas Theological Seminary and a former pastor for 28 years. In August 2001, he was diagnosed with lung cancer, and a year later, he went home to be with the Lord. And he wrote this essay on suffering, and it just brings amazing perspective. And I believe it's important for us to have perspective with regards to different aspects of our lives, obviously. But when it comes to suffering, I think perspective helps us if we understand what suffering is. Why do we suffer? All those kind of things. So the first thing that he answers is the question, what is suffering? And the first thing he says is that suffering includes anything that hurts us. So if we say that we are suffering, it means that there's something that hurts us. You see, we can be busy with our everyday lives, but the moment we get hurt, our attention will inevitably actually turn to our suffering. You see, we will ask the question most probably, what's going on? Why am I hurt? Why am I suffering? What is the cause of my hurt or the suffering? You see, a hurt is like a road sign telling us to stop and take note. Now, if there's something wrong with our bodies normally, our bodies will give us a signal. There will be a pain or something in our body that tells us, listen, there's something wrong. We need to actually just stop for a moment and find out, get a diagnosis, see what's wrong. And likewise, when we suffer in life, when there's hurt, it is an indication for us to just stop. The second thing he says about suffering is that suffering includes anything that irritates us, not only hurts us, but irritates us. You see, you can walk for kilometers without a problem, but the moment a small stone gets into your shoe and it starts irritating you, you will get to the point where you have to stop and you have to deal with it. You see, when something irritates us, we have to deal with it because it becomes just more and more irritating as time goes on. Now, likewise, when we experience suffering, we will have to deal with it some other time in our life. We can't just leave it. And we need to handle suffering in a specific way. Now, the third thing he says about suffering is that in God's amazing design, He uses suffering to get us to think. You see, suffering gets us to the place where we start asking questions, like, why am I here? Am I living the kind of life that truly pleases God? What am I doing with my life? Where am I going? Why is this happening to me now? So suffering helps us to get to the point where we start thinking about things much more deeply than what we normally would. The fourth thing he says about suffering is that suffering is a tool. And God uses the tool of suffering to sometimes get our attention. You see, we can get so busy with the here and now stuff in our lives that we neglect eternal things. I mean, it's easy to get caught up in the everyday things. I mean, there's so many things in life that can just catch our attention and just hold our attention. But suffering gets us to the point where we stop for a moment. Now, it's interesting. When we stop and we start paying attention to the things that have true eternal value, let's call it eternal value in life, then we start getting a new perspective on life. And we get a new perspective on the suffering that we might experience. You see, suffering gets our attention, and it can help us to focus on God and on His purposes in life. And that brings us to the fifth thing that he says about suffering. And that is that suffering is also a tool which God uses to accomplish His purposes and His plans in our lives. You see, He does it in a way that would never have occurred without us experiencing hurt and trials or some irritation that stops us in our tracks. I mean, God may allow cancer or just a sore throat. It may be an illness or a loss of someone close to us. It may be a personal failure or a disappointment. It may be a rumor that is circulating about us that is damaging our reputation and bringing us grief and anxiety. I mean, it can actually be anything that ranges from something as small as and as irritating as the bite of a mosquito, to the charge of an elephant, or having to face the lions in the lion's den like Daniel in Daniel chapter 6. It's amazing how God will use everything in our lives, or anything in our lives, especially the life of a believer, because we experience it very closely and deeply, and He does it to accomplish His purposes and His plans in our life. Absolutely amazing how the Lord does it. Beloved, the way we look at suffering is very important, especially for us as believers. I mean, we can either become despondent, we can become discouraged, depressed, or we can look at our suffering as an opportunity to grow spiritually, mentally, and emotionally. Ultimately, you know what? The choice is ours. The choice is absolutely ours to make. So, I hope it gives a little bit of perspective on what suffering is, so that we can look at it from a little bit of a different perspective. God willing, until next time, thank you for listening. Bye-bye.